All right, so this is Christianity and Liberalism, lecture number 3, chapter on God and man. And I've called the lecture title State over Savior. And just to remind you what the goals of the class are, the goals of this class are to examine J. Gresham Machen's critique in his book, Christianity and Liberalism, his critique of modernism and liberal Christianity. And then the second goal of this class is to understand our own situation as a historic church affiliated with a liberal Protestant denomination. So just to recap, Machen's critique of modernism and liberal Christianity is as follows. Modernism, he said, rejected God's creative role in Christianity's origin. So there was no supernatural origin to Christianity according to the liberal Protestant, the modernist Protestant. So the idea of the virgin birth out the window, right? The idea that Jesus was somehow God incarnate out the window. It was just an ordinary man. That's what the liberal or modernist Christian creed was. Anything supernatural, any miracles that Jesus would have done that you read in the Bibles, embellishments, right? The stuff of legend. So modernism, liberal Christianity rejected all of those supernatural aspects of Christianity as it related to the beginning or the foundation of Christianity. Modernism resorted to a dishonest use of tradition, using traditional forms for non-redemptive purposes. I covered that 2 weeks ago in that lecture. The main thing to remember there is that seminaries were teaching at this time, and we're talking about 100 years ago, seminaries were teaching at this time modernist thought, and they were shaping future pastors that would come to pulpits like the one we have here. Machen accused these liberal seminary professors of hiding their radical beliefs and of teaching their students to do the same once they were ordained and deployed to their pulpits. So you had this phenomenon that one of the stories I shared with you from that lecture 2 weeks ago was my own experience in a Catholic school growing up. Modernism and liberalism came to the Catholic Church about 30, 40 years after it came to the Protestant Church. So by the time I was going to Catholic school in the 1980s, it was in full swing. And I remember having Jesuit teachers say, now, what we're teaching you here is very different than what Sister Mary Sunshine taught you back in parochial school. Don't go back and tell her what we're teaching you. So this dishonesty, this fundamental dishonesty about modernism and liberalism was something Machen held up for critique. Seminaries were teaching basically wolves how to be wolves in sheep's clothing. Naturalistic liberalism is non-Christian, he said, and it's distinct from historic Christianity, foretelling an inevitable institutional split with implications for broader American culture. And that's how I ended the last lecture, was that Machen saw some hope for a united American culture that was based in a common history, a common tradition, even a common heritage. But that was 100 years ago. And without that, which I think has even been further eroded, do we even have anything like morals in common anymore? And I was arguing that no, we don't. So the decline of our culture has only continued in the past 100 years. And whereas Machen could say, well, at least we all agree on what right is and what wrong is. We all agree to drive on the right side of the road and not the left. So if you liberal or modernist Christian don't want to believe in the actual resurrection, that's fine. We could still all be Americans. But that was the situation 100 years ago. I argued at the end of last time's lecture that the further erosion of anything we have in common has just even made that premise difficult to believe. So with that we turn to chapter 3, God and Man. The title of this chapter is God and Man. So who is God? The Christian gospel is an account of how God saved man. But before this gospel can be received, we have to answer 2 questions. The first is, who is God? And the second is, what is man? And Machen argued that the modernist liberal answer to both questions is diametrically opposed to the Christian one. This is one of Machen's constant themes. Whatever modernists or liberals say is completely opposed to Christianity, to historic Christianity. So don't believe any attempt to harmonize the two. That don't be beguiled. Don't get drawn in. If somebody tells you that they are a modernist or a liberal Christian, what Machen wants you to say is that's a contradiction. And the other thing, just to point out, is that the way he's using liberal and is not one-to-one with the way we might use it today to assign it to a political party or a political movement. He's talking about liberalism in theology, liberalism in the church, which again, denies any supernatural reality. So that's why he says it's diametrically opposed to the Christian answer to the question of what is God and what is man. The liberal will say one does not need to know who God is. That is, we don't need to reduce God to a definition or an enumeration of his attributes, like holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Rather, we only need to feel his presence. I don't know what all of your individual religious histories have been, but certainly in my own, I've encountered many a preacher or many a spiritually minded person who wants me to simply feel the presence of God, to be at one, right, with God. And what Machen is saying is, watch out for that, because you can't reduce God to just a feeling. And the example he gives is our human friendships, right? All of us have or our human relationships. All of us certainly can remember the feeling of being with our mother, the presence of our mother, right? But what's the most common insult you could say? Your mother is a what, right? Or your mother wears combat boots. That's probably the most polite one. I remember that when I was a kid. And what's that designed to do? It's designed to get you angry. Why? Because the person who's saying that has committed slander against your mother. In other words, one of the attributes of your mother is that she's your mother and she's kind and she's loving and she bakes pies for you and she tucks you in at night. How dare you say anything against my mother? Well, what does it matter what I say about your mother as long as you could feel her presence? Well, that's what Machen is saying the liberal modernist does. If you say that God is not truth, or if you say that God is not real, or if you say that God is not timeless, or if you say that God is not love, or he's not merciful, or he's not just, if you say any of those things, then you're denying who God is. So it's much more than just simply feeling the presence of God. And to reduce God to a feeling is basically to deny God. And what Machen says is that's exactly what modernism does. It's exactly what liberal Christianity does. It reduces God to a feeling, to a personal feeling. So he says if we're willing to defend our human friends and our mothers, how much more should we defend what we know to be true about God? We know him in specific ways. We know specific attributes about God. And then he says, Machen, that the modernist liberal refused to define what he knew about God and therefore refused to defend him. The modernist liberal was very averse to definitions, categories, buckets. As I said last week, he was averse to doctrine. The modernist liberal does not want to be bound by doctrine, partly because doctrine sets bright lines. You either believe this or you don't believe it. If you don't believe it, then you can't be part of the church. I'll take a question. Just remember, it's recording, so if you want to have it on the podcast, that's okay. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that I think it goes even a step further.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at it, if we start comparing how we feel or behave, if you sense my presence is in the room, right?
Right.
And you know I'm here, but you just choose not to address me, acknowledge me, appreciate me, talk to me, have a relationship with me. Isn't that a form of rejection?
Yes.
Isn't that, it's worse to me if you feel God's presence than if you didn't feel him at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you feel his presence and then you don't form a relationship or you don't identify and you don't make effort, to be closer to God, to acknowledge God, to accept God. It's like, he's there,
right,
but you don't care.
It's like saying, I know my mother's with me, but I don't care to know anything about her.
Right.
I don't care to know how she feels. Or I know my father is with me, but I don't care to know anything about his family or where I came from, right? It's just, I'm fine with his presence. As you say, that's not really showing you're even appreciative of that much.
You'd be better off never feeling his presence.
That's
because
right.
At least then, you didn't know he was there, but now you know he's there and you're not caring.
And you didn't bother to do anything about it. Exactly. You didn't bother to investigate what is known about God. So our sources for knowledge about God, Machen says, are the same ones to which Jesus and his disciples had access. And that's an important point. We don't have any more access to knowledge about God than Jesus and his disciples had. Jesus plainly found God's hand in nature, also in the moral law. And finally, Jesus plainly found God revealed in the scriptures. Those are the same instruments that we have for knowing about God. Now, you could say that we have had the benefit of 2,000 more years of reflecting on the revealed word of God in the scriptures. So there's a lot of richness in the Christian tradition for us to explore. But we don't necessarily know, there's no new knowledge about God. We didn't discover some additional attribute. Like I learned the periodic table of the elements when I was in high school. And I gather a few more elements have been added to it since I was a kid, right? We're not, that doesn't happen with God. We don't just discover, oh, you know what? God's also love. No, we don't add that element. We don't add that attribute because we already knew it. So there's nothing more to know about God. We're not going to have another source of knowledge about God than what is in the moral law, nature, or scriptures, which is the same exact set of sources that Jesus and the disciples had. So the disciples had the same access to this knowledge without which the early church's assertion that Jesus is Lord, by which they meant Jesus is God, would have had no meaning. The bucket or the container, the category God already existed and had meaning. So they knew what God was. This is what Machen calls rational theism, and it's at the root of Christianity. The root of modernism, however, he says, is quite different. Modernism stresses universals like goodness and truth, but hesitates to define them in overtly particular ways. And those of you who were at the Bible study last Wednesday will know that we struggled with this idea of God is spirit or God is a spirit. That's in John chapter 4, verse 24, I think. But King James translates it as God is a spirit, and more modern translations translate it as God is spirit. And spirit is a bucket. You're supposed to know what it means. So that when we say God is a spirit or God is spirit, we're assigning God to an already existing category that you have some idea what it means. All right, so that can only be done as an exercise of what Machen calls rational theism. In other words, we're using our brain to explore this feeling we have of the presence of God. This is why modernist seminary professors likely objected to Machen's characterization of them as deceivers. To their way of thinking, it was perfectly true and truthful to say Jesus is a symbol of the Father's goodness. A modernist wouldn't have any problem saying that. I'm happy to accept Jesus as a symbol of the Father's goodness. Machen stressed, however, that historical Christianity cannot be content with that assertion. For Machen, Christianity is always grounded in history, the specific events of the first century. And that's something he keeps coming back to in his book. Out of those events came knowledge of a real person, Jesus, with whom it is still possible to have a relationship, a personal relationship. Owning the events of the first century is what proved to be hard for modernist liberals. So you see what I'm saying here? A modernist, a liberal, it's kind of like, have you ever argued with somebody who will, you get one layer into the argument and their response is something like, what, you don't like good things to happen to people, or you don't like love, or you hate people? Like the whole gay marriage debate, I think, devolved into that. What, you don't want me to be happy? Well, so if you reduce an argument to that point, if you abstract an argument to this universal, you don't want me to be happy. And you divorce it from specific commands that the Bible has, like don't do this, don't lie with a man the way you would with a woman, which is what it says in Leviticus, right? You try to separate that hard fact, that doctrine, from this more general category of happiness. The modernist liberal has no problem with the general categories. God is love. He loves that. God is a spirit. He loves that. God is truth. Modernist liberal Christians will say this as long as the day is long. And that's one of the reasons they were able to so effectively, I think, deceive the church. But if you say to a modernist liberal, oh, but do you believe that the tomb was empty? Oh, well, the sarx may have still been there, but the soma came back. They'll throw, those are Greek words for body. Sarx and soma mean body. Soma refers to a spiritual body. Sarx refers to the flesh. So they'll come up with all kinds of ways to spin it so that they don't have to say the actual confession of the Christian faith, which is that the tomb was empty, right? And that the man was born of a virgin. Oh, well, Parthenos just means a maiden or a young woman. Yes, but culturally, any young woman, any maiden was by definition a virgin. Well, you don't know that. You see how the liberal modernist works? Do you see how he uses his sleight of hand? And what he always does is he separates the text from its plain meaning and then from his faith. So the modernist seminary professor was probably insulted when Machen called him a deceiver, because the modernist seminary professor was quite willing to pull out a whole list of categories to which he most happily subscribed. But if you really tried to pin him down on whether you believe that the events as recorded in the Bible that took place in the first century when Jesus was ministering actually happened, that's where the modernist has a hard time believing. So if we try to put ourselves in the shoes of today's modernist liberal Christians, separated as they are from Machen's critique by a century, what can we say? And the first is that while the category of God remains, while the category of God remains, the category of man has largely been discarded for more inclusive terms. Like, we don't say man a lot anymore. We try to say humankind or other more inclusive terms. While the traditional form of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit remains in use, wherever possible, you'll hear a modernist or a liberal Christian try to recast the Trinity in genderless modes. They'll often say things like creator, redeemer, sustainer. That's one of the ones I heard a lot. We see here a continuation of the process Machen described. The idea of universals had been kept intact, but the particulars continue to be stripped away. Right? So if you will say, I believe in truth, that's good. That's a universal. Can you also say that Jesus is truth? Oh, well, yeah, I guess. As long as I can also say Buddha is truth, and Krishna is truth, and that I myself am truth. Well, no, you can't say that, because then you're just universalizing everything. I need you to say that Jesus is the truth, the way, the light. And that's where the modernist Christian has a hard time. He likes the universals to the exclusion of the particulars. So to speak of the fatherhood of God is no longer so popular as it was in Machen's day. And it was, and I think this is where feminism and some inclusive language has come into play. We tend to downplay the term father. But we've kept the idea. Now we say loving creator or something like that. But then if you go and ask what is love to the modernist Christian today, be prepared for a vague answer. The operating definition of love today, it seems to me, is whatever consenting adults agree to. And in the past, it would have said two consenting adults, but even that qualifier is under assault. So what about duration? True love lasts forever, right? That's what the Hallmark Catechism tells us, right? But is love actually everlasting? And I think the modernist would say, well, sure, as long as there's consent, right? So in other words, the modernist has a hard time. The modernist will say, yes, I believe God is love. I believe in a loving creator. But if you press the modernist on the particulars of love, he's going to have to say, I don't know. Or I can't pin any one of those down. Or it depends. Or it depends on the situation. It's one thing, if you get into a situation and your relationships don't go the way you wanted them to, and you find yourself in sin, the Christian says, I'm in sin, and stops and repents. The modernist or the liberal says, well, that wasn't sin anyway. It wasn't sin in the first place. It was just love. And I'm talking about, fornication or premarital sex or even divorce, right? The Christian, I think, is capable of committing all of those sins, but at least the Christian will continue to say, I'm a sinner, I need a savior. The modernist is trying to say, those aren't even sins, right? It was the we don't know of modernism, particularly when it came to believing the facts of the first century as presented to us in Scripture, that sowed the seeds of skepticism that their postmodernist children have been harvesting ever since. Somewhere around the 1960s or 70s, we flipped from modernism into postmodernism, and the legacy of that is simply doubt, right? We're deep in the harvest of an age whose answer to every question is uncertain. If Christianity in our culture seems to you to be adrift, Machen would tell you it is because we have unmoored ourselves from history, particularly the events of the first century. So Machen's solution for all of these problems that are presented by modernism and liberalism and postmodernism is to take all of them and to continue to anchor them in the events of the first century, which is to say he continually anchors them in the New Testament. And the New Testament can't be really understood without the Old Testament, so he's anchoring all of our he's anchoring his answer to all of these questions in the text of the Bible. So that's God. God cannot be generalized as a universal or abstracted away. God always has to be identified with an incarnate, a human being who lived and walked among us. Emmanuel, Jesus dwelling with us. We talked about that today a little bit in Revelation. So that's God. What is man? The modernist knew how to answer this question, and he was very excited by his answer. In fact, he celebrated it as the essence of Christianity. The modernist thought he'd found the answer in the modern doctrine of the universal fatherhood of God, which made all mankind God's children and all men brothers. All right, so this you might have a little problem with as we get a little further into it, because you might start to think, oh, well, I kind of believe this, right? So the way the modernist answered the question, what is man, was to say, all men are children of the Father and all men are brothers. So the modernist preacher regarded this doctrine as reassuring and all sufficient. This was his answer for everything. All men are brothers, the brotherhood of man. And I dare say that even for you convinced Christians, there is something about this that rings true. How many of you have thought to yourself, we are all God's children? It's become such a commonplace. And yet, if I tell you that's not true, that's not biblical, you're going to wonder why I'm saying such a thing. The doctrine that we are endowed with worth, dignity, purpose, and therefore entitled to love, appreciation, and care is not just a fundamental doctrine of modernist liberalism. It informs nearly every aspect of our culture, from religion to healthcare, and from primary education to human resources, right? I'm going to stand up here and I'm going to tell you that you are not born with inherent dignity. You are not born with an entitlement to anybody's love, let alone God's. My dad used to say, the universe doesn't owe you a living, Jake, right? And yet modernism will tell you that every single child, just by fact of being born, somehow deserves, all it's entitled to love, appreciation, dignity, and respect. Now, that's true, but it's not because of the reason the modernist says. So we'll get to this. A few examples will suffice to illustrate my point. On modern religion, the final portion of the baptismal covenant from the Episcopal Church's 1979 Book of Common Prayer, in that baptismal covenant, the minister asks, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? To which the candidate for baptism replies, I will, with God's help. And just 2 weeks ago, or I guess this was longer ago, but Pope Leo XIV, when he was still Cardinal Prevost, spoke these words to a Catholic congregation in New Lenox, Illinois, last August, just a little less than a year ago. He said, every one of us, whether we were born in the United States of America or on the North Pole, we are all given the gift of being created in the image and likeness of God. And the day we forget that is the day we forget who we are. We forget who Christ has called us to be. This is pure modernism. From a modern healthcare provider's patient bill of rights. A patient has the right to, quote, be treated with dignity and respect by each health unit staff member, end quote. In Connecticut Region 14, which is our public school region, one learning goal for students is to, quote, demonstrate empathy, which means, quote, they understand and respect the ideas, beliefs, and values of others to foster an inclusive environment. So the assumption here in this educational model is that this is one that's based on the modernist liberal doctrine that the ideas, beliefs, and values of others are worthy of understanding and respect simply because they belong to others. How would a pedagogy that's based on historical Christianity and rooted in the events of the first century, how would it be different? I think it would be very different, because we have in Matthew 28, verse 18, Jesus saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And a verse later, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So the idea that everyone has beliefs that are worthy of respect and appreciation runs head into Jesus' command to go and teach them what he's taught them, right? In order for me to teach you what Jesus has commanded me, I've got to unlearn the things you've been taught, which means I have to, at some level, disrespect them, right? So this is where I think the two run into each other. The Episcopal Church's 1979 baptismal covenant, the Patient's Bill of Rights, and Region 14's learning goals, and even Pope Leo XIV's sermon, they all sound reassuring. And a case can be made that they even reflect Christian values. Indeed, how else were the citizens of Connecticut, overwhelmingly Congregationalist in its polity and Christian in its faith, convinced to cede so much of what once belonged to the church and was under her purview to the fatherhood of the state? That's a loaded passage that I just said there. What did I just say? What did I say that the modernist, how did the modernist define man? The modernist defines man as a creature, a being, someone who exists under the fatherhood of God, and where all men are brothers. All right? That's the definition of man. We're all brothers and sisters, just by virtue of the fact that God is our Father. All right? How do you operationalize that? How do you put that into practice? Well, one way to do that is to assign the role of father or parent to the state, right? Because not all of us are Christian. Not all of us believe in Jesus Christ. Not all of us are Muslim. Not all of us are Jewish. Not all of us are atheist or whatever. And in fact, Christianity is quite explicit. The New Testament is quite explicit. The only way that we become sons of God is through belief in his name. That's John chapter 1. We have to be adopted into God's family. So the fact that we're all born does not make us God's children. But who registers your birth? Who records your birth? Who gives you a number when you're born? So who's your father? Who's taken the role of the father in the liberal modern state? The state, right? So Machen said that the modernist found this to be a reassuring, all-sufficient thing, this idea of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. But he said that this really belongs at best only to that vague natural religion, which comes into direct opposition to the New Testament. And I highlighted this hymn in the first lecture, Van Dyck's 1907 hymn. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee. I actually like the hymn, but I think I like it more because it's set to the ode to joy, right? It has these words: Thou our Father, Christ our brother, all who live in love are thine. And the fourth stanza concludes the hymn with these words: Father love is reigning o'er us, brother love binds man to man. This is a modernist hymn written in 1907. Here's where the definition of God as Father of all and of all men as brother breaks down. This modernist liberal doctrine does not advance Christianity at all, but it does catechize its contemporary disciples to submit to the state. So long as those disciples were born and reared into some vague Christianity, the modernist liberal was content to use a vague Christianity in his catechesis. And you remember 2 weeks ago when I covered the lecture on doctrine, I used the example of our own Sunday school curriculum here at First Church Woodbury. Up until the 1920s, the Sunday school curriculum here had been founded on the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which was an explicitly reformed Protestant exposition of the faith. It was thrown away in the 1920s, and a more vague, naturalistic Sunday school curriculum was adopted. So the Sunday school students went from learning the attributes of God to learning about being a good citizen, learning about property rights, learning about respect, learning about truth, learning about kindness. All of you will say to me, those are all good things to learn. Those are all the basics of good citizenship. We want our children to learn that. But the problem is, and the author of our church's history even comments on this, in doing that move, in making that move, we were removing what made this a historically Protestant Reformed church. We were removing the distinctives. And removing the distinctives is one of the first steps, one of the first moves that a modernist makes. Because I want to take a bunch of different people with their own creeds, their own family histories, their own ethnic and national heritages, and I want to make them American. I want to make them good citizens. I want to replace God the Father with God the state. And the way I do that is by rubbing off all of the edges until you are smooth and reborn in the image and likeness of Caesar, right? So that's where the definition of God as Father of all breaks down, and all men as brothers break down. And this is why Machen can say this doesn't advance actual Christianity at all. Because actual Christianity means coming into a living relationship with a man who lived in the first century, and yet we still say is alive today and reigns from heaven, right? In a few weeks, we're going to celebrate the Ascension, which comes 50 days after Easter. The Ascension is the physical ascending of Christ in his resurrected body to heaven, to sit on God's right hand, to rule, right? To be a Christian is to believe that there is a man sitting on the throne of the universe right now, ruling it. That is a threat to any earthly power that doesn't submit to it. So you could see why you would want to remove that supernatural element from the education of our young people, our children, and from the pulpits. Anybody who dares to preach that is going to get in trouble. So long as those disciples were born, so what he's saying, Machen, is that for as long as the culture was Christian enough, modernists knew they had to use Christian vocabulary, and they were good at doing that. He says, quoting a hypothetical modernist, Machen says, "We may not be very orthodox in the theological sense, but of course you will recognize us as Christians because we accept Jesus' teachings as to the Father, as to God the Father." So basically he's saying you modernists are very good at fooling everyday Christians because you use a lot of Christian vocabulary. That was 100 years ago. Today's descendants of the modernist liberals of Machen's day are no longer concerned about gaining Christian acceptance, right? I mean, 100 years ago, this country was through and through Christian. So if you wanted to ascend to any kind of power, if you wanted to take over this country's culture, if you wanted to take over this country's government, you had to appear Christian. You had to at least give the appearance of Christian. So you had a lot of wolves come into the pulpits of churches for that reason. Now that they've done their work and the churches are on the ropes with 5 or 10 people in them and nobody paying attention to what the church says, those same enemies of God don't need to hijack the church anymore because the church is basically defunct at this point, which is why I think you don't see any respect for Christianity or God in the public square anymore. I preached about the Swingers Club a few weeks ago that opened up across the driveway from a church. That level of arrogance would have been unheard of even when I was a child, right? 40 years ago. We are at the point now where there is absolutely no respect, no restraint on evil anymore. And that is largely, and so we don't see the enemies of the church even bothering to use church language or Christian language anymore. Their hatred for Christ, their hatred for the gospel, their hatred for the church is full out and on full display right now. Machen wrote, "The gospel itself refers to something entirely different. The really distinctive New Testament teaching about the fatherhood of God concerns only those who have been brought into the household of faith," right? The only people who can call God their father and the only people that God will recognize as his sons and daughters are those who belong to the household of faith. It is, which is the church, right? It is disruptive to the orderly government of the state when a significant number of its citizens acknowledge another than the state as their father and do not recognize all others residing in the earthly commonwealth as fellow children of that father. This is why the Christians were persecuted in ancient Rome, because they would not recognize Caesar as the father and they would not recognize fellow pagan Romans as their brothers. The kingship of Jesus Christ, another inconvenient first century fact recorded for us in the New Testament, poses a direct challenge to the kingship claims of the modern state. That state, according to Machen, was both collectivist and pagan. But Machen did not mean pagan as a term of reproach. Paganism, he wrote, is that view of life which finds the highest goal of human existence in the healthy and harmonious and joyous development of existing human faculties. Be your best self, right? What could be more Christian than this pious-sounding paganism? And I'm willing to bet that 9 out of 10 Christians today, even conservative Christians, would be hard-pressed to say what is wrong with it, right? I think the strangeness of the normalization of homosexuality in the last 20 years, combined with the ugliness of transgenderism, can help us understand what is wrong. It's hard, for instance, to tout the health benefits of being a gay man. No matter what you want to say about it, showing that this is actually something that promotes health is not, the medical data isn't there. It is difficult to say that surgical and chemical treatments for gender dysphoria have brought about harmony, right? These are all the pagan goals: health, harmony, right? For either the recipients or the treatments, or for the recipients of such transgender treatments, or for society. The rampant use of surrogacy by homosexual couples, particularly male homosexual couples, takes the joy out of childbirth, relegating the womb to the status of a rented appliance while robbing the child of his or her mother. All that said, it's taken over a century to reach this point, the extreme dead end of modernist liberalism. And now that we're here, more and more of us are saying we've had enough, right? So, paganism comes to you as an angel bearing good gifts, bearing light. Paganism, the pagan spirit comes to you and says, I'm going to help you be your highest self. I'm going to help you self-actualize. You have wonderful gifts and talents. You're made in the image of God. I'm going to help you live your highest and healthiest and most harmonious life. Why? Because it's all in you. All of these wonderful gifts that God has given you. You just have to grow them. You just have to water them. We just have to plant the children in the right soil, and they will grow up to be wonderful creatures. None of the paganism never comes to you, to anyone, and says, you need to be born again. Paganism never comes to you and says, you already have one foot in the grave and you will spend the rest of your eternity there if you don't accept Jesus Christ. That is never what paganism says. And yet, when we embrace paganism as a culture, as we've done for the last 100 years, can we say that we're healthier? No. Can we say that we're living in harmony? Absolutely not. Do we have joy in this culture? Not much. So it's taken us a century to get to that point. How then is one to gain access to the household of faith? Remember, how do you become a child of God? It's not because you successfully were born by your mother. That's not how you become a child of God. You become a child of God through baptism, through faith, through regeneration. How do you learn to stop calling the state your father and learn to call upon God? First, you have to face the fact that you have a broken heart. This is Machen talking now. You have to face the fact that you have a broken heart. Not just the sadness that comes when emotional trauma occurs, but that your heart is actually broken. You say, love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know how to love myself, right? So my heart is broken. You have to come face to face with that fact, which means you have to confront the sin, which is constantly breaking your heart. In saying that Christianity is the religion of the broken heart, Machen wrote, we do not mean that Christianity ends with the broken heart. The psalmist writes in Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Christianity means, Machen continues, that sin is faced once and for all, and then is cast by the grace of God forever into the depths of the sea. And that's really what I was preaching today, right? The former things have passed away. All the things that bring us grief, all the things that make us cry are being put away by God. And we are being made new. But that's not how we're born. We have to be made new. This is the difference between the state's plan and the gospel's plan for life, between the law of Moses and the Sermon on the Mount. Both the state and the law can compel medical doctors and teachers to meet some minimum standard of dignity and respect. This is an important point to make, right? Is there anything wrong with being healthy? No. Is there anything wrong with being joyful? No. Is there anything wrong with living in harmony? No. Is there anything wrong with being sympathetic or empathetic? No. The problem with these things is that the most the state can ever do through the public school or through policing or whatever is force you to meet some minimum, right? That's all the law of Moses ever tried to do, was force people to meet some minimum. When you hear the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus basically says, not only is the minimum where you're not going to cut it, you have to reach this maximum, right? It's not enough that you don't sleep with a woman who's not your wife. If you even look at a woman who's not your wife with desire, you have committed adultery with her. So Jesus only he takes this and maximalizes it, which is to underscore the fact that we need a savior, right? No amount of law, no amount of legislation, no amount of pagan religion will ever be enough. And that's the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount. This Sermon on the Mount requires a higher ethic. Doctors who heal as Christ healed and who sympathize with such that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? I mean, the world can manufacture empathy. The world can manufacture sympathy. But can the world create a God who, while we were yet sinners, who dies for us? No, it takes God to do that. Then Machen writes, after sin has been removed by the grace of God, the Christian can proceed to develop joyously every faculty that God has given him, right? So this is it. It's not that what the pagans want. It's not that what the state is teaching is in and of itself wrong. It's that it does not give us the ability to actually live up to it. This is what I was saying today. We are saved not by the works that we do. We are saved so that our works can be good. Right? And the only state that is going to be good is a state that understands this. The message is indeed good news. This message is indeed good news, but the message is only as reliable as the medium by which it is transmitted. The gospel message in particular is very old and has passed down through many hands. How reliable is it really? And so that's the question we'll turn to next week, the question of the Bible. How reliable is this message that I've basically been saying to you with Machen, that we have to anchor ourselves in the events of the first century. We have to have a religion that is supernatural. How reliable is the story of that first century? How reliable is the account of those supernatural events? And that's what we'll turn to next week.